Good afternoon, Ron. May I ask you a little bit about your life before the war?
Right. I was born on 16th of August 1923, so therefore I was 16 when war broke out. And my parents lived in an alleyway and had a workshop above the building. The building itself was about 3 or 4 stories high, and because I was one of a large family, that is 11 children, unusual even for the East End where families were naturally large, and most of the boys worked in the family business, where I did for a while. When I was 16, war broke out, and my father decided it would be a good thing to get us, at least the younger members of the family, away to a safer place, and he hired what must have been the last lorry available in London at the time, and we arrived down in Brighton the day before war broke out. I was actually swimming in the sea when the first sirens went, and I was to commute every day from Brighton to London, where I was still working. And then in 1940 my father decided that commuting was too hard, and he moved us, as it turns out very unwisely, back to London just in time for the Blitz, and that was in August 1940. And we were living in a place in Stamford Hill, and we saw, when we looked southward, we could see the glare in the sky, which was the Germans bombing the docks. From Stamford Hill we moved to Houghton Regis in Bedfordshire, that's about 6 miles away from Luton, and did the same commute every day, and that was quite horrendous. And I was actually pleased when I was called up, because all my friends had been gradually being called up one by one, and although I was an air raid warden, it was still a bit of a lonely life. And this takes us up to the period when I went in the forces.
Can I ask you about your 4 brothers and their service records?
As you know, I was one of 5 brothers. Lou was the senior one, and he finished up as a clerk, I think, in the Ordnance Corps. Next was Jack, who volunteered for the Air Force. Part of the reason why he volunteered for the Air Force because he was Polish by birth and was not allowed to join the forces, but he had in fact to volunteer, and after a while the government allowed it, and he joined the RAF, I think, in late 44. Next in line was my brother, let's get it right, Lou, Jack. Then there was Mossy. Mossy was a PT instructor for the KRRs, and there's a standing family joke about that, because part of his life during the period that he was an instructor was standing on a raised platform in front of perhaps 1,000 troops, and with me begin jumping up and down, sort of thing. And years after the war, people used to recognise him and expect him to recognise them. But of course, they knew him. They knew he was Corporal Goldie or Goldstein, but he didn't know them at all. They were just a face in the mass. Then there was my brother Mick, who joined he joined an infantry, initially an infantry regiment, and then the the artillery. And Mick had a very interesting life, because later on he came out to Italy and joined the Jewish Brigade, which had been formed fairly late in the war. And I tried desperately to see him, and in fact sometimes my tanks, I could see his actual tack signs that telling us he was in the locale, but I couldn't stop and he couldn't stop, so we never got to meet each other in wartime. And then he went to India, and he was at RSM at a gunnery school in India. And then there was myself. I started off at Bury St Edmunds, joined an infantry training regiment to learn the simple start of being a soldier and being able to march and to carry a rifle and things like that. This was a 6 weeks course, and while I was there, they put us through various aptitude tests to decide what we were going to do following that. And I must have had an aptitude for Morse code, because I found myself sent to a training regiment in Whitby in Yorkshire, and I was trained as a driver op, and our training was equally between driving and learning to use wireless sets. Fortunately for me, the set on which I was taught was a 19 set, and I was delighted when later on in another portion of my life in the army, I was sent to Rieti in the middle of Italy to learn to be a loader operator, and I was trained on Sherman tanks, and I was delighted to find that they had the 19 sets. So it's very, very easy for me. But going back to when I left the training regiment at Whitby, I was sent initially to an ACAC regiment in Barnard Castle, I think it was, or Hot Whistle. I haven't got my notes to hand, so I can't remember which. And from there, I was sent to Congleton in Cheshire, where I joined a unit that was being formed to be part of the wireless operators who were being sent out to Italy. What you need to know is, prior to this happening, the means of communication within an ACAC regiment was the Donar, or the dispatch rider. And he was literally the link between gun batteries and BHQs and RHQs and things like that. So anytime anybody wanted to inform somebody, they would use a Donar. It was decided, and it was a very good move, to create these driver operators class and have 3 wireless operators on a truck, a 1500 weight Bedford truck, and we were the links between. We then formed the links. So there was, every troop had one of these trucks, and BHQ had one, RHQ had one, and from that you could go right down to command. And so I was sent to Congleton in Cheshire to form the group that was forming up. There were 400, I remember there were 400 in the group. I can even remember my group number, which was REAYK, which was the draft number. And we were to sail from Greenock to Algiers. And I was sent out to join the 49th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, who were then in Tunis. The fighting was still going on, by the way, in the First Army.
Ron, now you arrived in Algiers in April 1943 to join the First Army.
Yes.
Can you explain the period of the next 3 months?
Right. I arrived in Algiers, but instead of being posted directly to my unit, I was stuck in a transit camp, and the war was still going on. I was told that I was to join the 49th ACAC, but it appeared the authorities were not in a hurry to do this. In fact, I joined my actual regiment, I think, some 12 days after the fighting had finished in North Africa. I remember it's a question of 12 days because one time I write on a forum, a World War II forum called www2talk.com, and I've mentioned that people have written on that about the qualifications for getting a class to put on your Africa Star. And they used to say to me, Ron, you say that, as I did, as my records show, that I arrived well before the campaign finished, but did not join the regiment until 12 days after. And surely you would still be entitled to the Africa Star. So in response to this, I wrote to the War Office, and I received a reply that said, we understand that you were in North Africa while the campaign was going on, but you didn't actually join your unit until 12 days after the war had finished. Therefore, regretfully, you're not entitled to. And I was a little bit miffed about that, because I thought to myself, while we were in Algiers, we were being bombed almost nightly, and had I been killed, and my my family would have received my medals, they might have questioned why wasn't I entitled to have a First Army class. But anyway, that's a long time, and I'm not bothered about it. We joined the regiment at Tunis, having travelled by train for 3 days from Algiers to Tunis. And the king shortly after the king came out to have a parade. And the members of the 49th were obviously marched past him. And I, as a newcomer to the regiment, was obliged to stay behind and guard the premises. And I was told that I should pay particular attention to the toilets. So I questioned this, and I said, why is this necessary? And I was told that the local Arab inhabitants were very fond of stealing the excreta to use as fertiliser for their fields. So I can proudly say that while my regiment marched past the king in Tunis, I stayed behind and guarded the shithouse.
The 49th LAA were part of the 78th Division, and towards the end of July, the 78th Battle Axe Division moved from Tunisia to Sicily. Can you describe the first landings there, and then
we landed I think north of Augusta, and in a landing craft, and there's a humorous story to do with that, because although I'd driven onto the landing craft, this particular landing craft only held 2 vehicles, and one vehicle, the vehicle behind me, was the CO, or rather the OC, and then there was my vehicle. And to my horror, when we got to the other side, I couldn't start up. And the Major Moland, as he was, the OC, was getting very annoyed and using some ripe language to implying that I, as a driver, was responsible with the vehicle not being able to start. And I was rather ignominiously pulled off by the harbour master. He instructed somebody to yank me off the thing. And fortunately for me, I found that once we'd been left at the roadside and we got one of the REs to come down and sort us out, we found that the battery lead had jumped off. In cleaning, it hadn't been tightened enough, and it just jumped off the battery, and that was put down. This was my first experience of warfare, and it was while we were passing through a place called Adrana that I wrote a poem. Incidentally, the only poem I've written, and the only poem I'm ever likely to write, but I can still remember it. The poem goes like this: darkness had fallen as we entered the town, but was still light enough to see the shattered ruins of what had been a town in Sicily. It wasn't much to call a town compared with those of greater size. It wasn't built for modern war, and now a stinking heap it lies, shattered beneath the azure skies of Sicily. It seemed as if an angry god had gone amok with gory hands, then dropped a veil or a canopy of dirty, choking, blinding sands, and as to wreak his vengeance more, had propped a body in each door. We drove on by with sober thought of those poor bastards who'd been caught. We grimaced at the sick sweet smell of this small piece of man-made hell. This could be you, the body said. This could be you, soon gone, soon dead. We hurried by enough to be alive that day in Sicily. And I have to tell you, there's a small story that goes with that. When I originally wrote the poem, I put it on the BBC site. The BBC had a site at that time called People's War, and they objected to the poem because I'd used the word bastard. This despite my complaints that bastard could be found in any English dictionary. It was part of the English language. So they said I couldn't use the word bastard, but I could use B ARD. So begrudgingly I did this, and they published the poem. Years later, I was on the site and I noticed that people were using the word bastard. So I wrote a letter to the BBC complaining, and they said, yes, we've changed our policy and we've decided people can use that word. So I said, in which case, can I have my bastard back? And I was relieved to find that not long after they republished my poem with the word bastard.
Ron, I know at the end of the Sicilian campaign you were arrested on the north coast of Sicily near Patti. Can you
Correct.
say something about that?
Well, we were heading towards the most northerly, northeasterly part of Sicily, ready for the invasion of Italy, and I'd been without sleep for about 3 days, I think, and I was the named driver, so therefore I was driving. My fellow wireless ops, there were 3 of us to the truck. They were quite happy to drive during the day, but come night time, so they said, you're the driver, and left me to it. And we used to drive without lights, and we used to follow the light on the differential, or the diff. And I remember following this thing, and I obviously must have fallen asleep. And the next thing I know, there's this almighty crash, and I've ridden literally up a telegraph pole. And if I looked to my left, I could see the sea below, and I looked to my right, I could see to my right to see the hills. And the 2 boys had woken up in the back of the truck and demanding what the hell's going on. And I realised what had happened. I released the brake which I'd put on automatically, and I slowly, if you can imagine it, I slowly slid down the telegraph pole, and with the boys hanging on the back there to make sure we didn't go into the sea. Years later, I was to see a photograph of, I believe, the actual spot, and you can see where there's no barriers. In those days, there were certainly no barriers to stop this happening. And anyway, to get back to the truck, one of the sergeants was sent for with wireless for one of the Remy sergeants, and he came along and he found that all that happened, the manifold had slipped. In those days, it was a Bedford 1500 weight, and it used to have a plastic top, and because of the impact, the plastic had shifted, and all the engine was exposed, and there was oil everywhere. But we dried the plugs, and lo and behold, we managed to get the thing going, and we drove on to Sicily.
In early September 1943, you crossed the mainland of Italy to
Right.
Reggio di
Yes.
Calabria,
Yes.
and then went across country, I believe, to Bari, and then started moving up.
No, Bari was on the Adriatic side.
That's right, over to the Adriatic side.
Yes.
Could you just brief description of some of the elements of that autumn? You moved up the coast towards
Right.
Termini and beyond.
We were treated like conquering heroes, if you like. People used to call out to us. They used to throw fruit. I remember on one case, an orange getting stuck underneath my accelerator, so I couldn't accelerate. And in my album, which we spend a word on later, I've drawn the sort of graffiti that one used to see, or written on the walls, welcoming us and wishing nasty things to happen to Mussolini. And we drove to Termini. It was at Termini where the Germans decided to attack, and for a brief moment we were forced out of the town, and then we came back in. I can remember what I considered an amusing episode was, by that time I had quite a knowledge of Italian, and I used to be taken with as an interpreter, simply because there was nobody with better Italian. And we went into a block of flats, and we were told that the officers wanted a couch. So there was nobody in the place, so the boys started carrying that out, whereupon the owner of the flat turned up, and he said, "I'm still here." He said, "Please leave my business. Can you take the couch of my neighbour upstairs? He's no intention of coming back." So this is what we did, and we finished up with a couch taken. I was also horrified at that time, I don't know whether this will remain on film, to find one of my fellow soldiers cutting a picture out of a frame on the wall. And I was rather shocked by this. I thought it's one thing to get a couch for the officers' mess, and another thing to literally steal photographs. And I remonstrated with him, and he said, I don't know what you're fussed about. He said, I send this stuff home to my wife, and by the time war finishes, I hopefully will have a few pounds put by. And this was my first and only intimation I found that I come under the heading of looting. We'd moved over from Termoli to the Fifth Army, where for the first time we were to fight alongside American troops. And it was also, funny enough, the first time that we were able to get American shirts. And it was the first time we were allowed to wear a tie. Because prior to that, officers were the only people entitled to wear a tie. But once we joined the Americans, their battle dress used to be open neck, and they used to wear a tie, and we followed suit. We were at a casino, and apart from one or two guns that we were using to defend the perimeter, the regiment was given various jobs such as stretcher bearing and smoke laying. Again, I was spared a lot because I was a wireless operator. We stopped using the wireless. We were told that the Germans were listening. We were able to listen into our wireless and would obtain information. And we started using telephones. And our job consisted of repairing the cables. Every time mortars came over, they used to destroy the cables, and we would have to go out and join them up again and phone back to find. We lived in slit trenches. We were dirty, we were hungry, we were tired. I fell ill and had a very bad dose of something regarded today as impetigo. And the boys on the truck persuaded me, you'd better go sick, Ron. I went to the local field dressing station. They examined me, and to my surprise, they instantly said that I've got to go into hospital. And I was taken down to Naples, where Vesuvius was busily erupting for the first time. And the first night, although I was enjoying the beauty of white sheets in a bed, I thought, this is lovely. The hospital was bombed. And I thought, just my bloody luck. And I hated the hospital. We were forced to wear medical kit. We were first of all wear hospital uniform, which consisted of blue trousers, red tie, white shirt, and a blue jacket. This was to mark us as hospital inmates, so that we were refused entry to bars and things like that. They wouldn't give us a drink if we'd wander into town in the evening. We went through Rome some 7 days after Mark Clark first went through. I think he went through on the 7th, and I think I went into Rome on the 14th. Had a day trip in Rome. This was wonderful. I was still very conscious of the fact that I was Jewish, and I wanted to meet up with the Jews of Rome who'd survived. And I found a garage just across the Tiber, opposite I found the local synagogue, and I asked where Jews would be hanging out, and I was told across the River Tiber, so across the river. And there was a garage, and outside the garage there was the words Judah written, and a big swastika. And I knocked. It had a garage door, and I knocked on the garage door, and I said, "Are there any Jews here?" And the fellow rather suspiciously said, "Why?" I said, "Because I'm a Jew, and I had a Shield of David that I used to hang from my battle dress pocket," and I pointed to that, and he embraced me, and I said, "Where are the Jews?" And he said, "Come with me," and he wheeled out an ancient motorbike, and we went back, and I found myself back at the Vatican, and all the people selling the stuff outside the Vatican walls were Jews. Apparently they'd been doing it for hundreds of years. They were allowed to. Somebody, sometime or other, must have decided it would be a good idea to give them a chance to make a living, and they were selling these stuff. And I was introduced by my friend, my new friend, as a British soldier, but a Jew. And all the kids were hanging on to me and rubbing my hands as though I was something from outer space. And when I left them, because I knew that the truck was leaving at about, shall we say, about 6 o'clock, they wanted to give me a souvenir of the visit. So they were looking, of course, what was a souvenir for a Jewish soldier? They could hardly give me a crucifix. So they finally decided what they would do. They found a gold chain with a crucifix. They took the crucifix off. They attached the shield of David that I had in my battle dress to the chain, hang it round my neck, and they all cheered, honour had been saved, and I left them. And on the way back, we stopped. They insisted I stop at somebody's house, have a glass of wine, and they were telling me that things were all right until the Germans had actually occupied Rome, and then that's when all the trouble started. And in my story, I wrote that all the fellas in the truck were talking about the various conquests that they made, including women and all the rest of it, and I didn't say a word until we got back to the camp. I had a week's leave in Cairo, but before I went to Cairo, there'd been lots of stories about probably the London Irish had been rioting in Cairo. One of the reasons was the strictness of the MPs who were stopping on the street for being improperly dressed, and the prices that had all been hiked because of the fact that there were troops in town. But I wrote to somebody who'd written about the riots, and they'd given the wrong date. And fortunately, I kept a diary at that time, and my date says just heard about the rioting in Cairo, so that they had the date wrong. I went to the Sphinx. I had a photograph taken on the back of a camel, I think it was, and I liked Cairo. Went to the museum. Went to Gezira, saw the Sphinx. I enjoyed it. That was a welcome break. I also, one of the things I did was I found myself, because the wireless are shut down, I found myself as driver to the OC, and I used to have to drive them into Cairo. And there's a small story about that. It was my 21st birthday, and I was having a drink in a bar, and somebody came over to me and said, "Are you drinking on your own?" Introduced himself, and his name was Jack Merry, and he said, "I'm a boat on one of these ships that carried troops from North Africa to Italy." And as luck would have it, when we eventually returned to Italy, it was his boat, and that was quite a thing. And I was invited to his cabin, and we ate very well. After we returned from Egypt, we finished up in the north of Italy, and were then given the news that we were about to be disbanded. For some reason or other, the authorities decided that the Luftwaffe were no longer the threat that they were, and they were going to disband all the light attack regiments and put the men to where they could be better serve the army. And I found myself sent to a place called Rieti in the centre of Italy, literally the geographical centre of Italy, and I spent 12 weeks being trained on Sherman tanks to be not only just a driver operator but a loader operator, because even on the Sherman tank the crew was normally 5. That was the tank commander, who would normally be standing with his head outside the turret. There'd be the gunner to his right, there'd be the loader to his left, there'd be the driver, and there'd be the wireless operator. But to my disgust, when I was finally sent to the 4th Hussars and joined the 4th Hussars in the line, I wasn't being used on a Sherman, I was being used on a Stuart Honey, which is a tank that had fought in the desert, and they discovered that if you took the turret off, it made a very good scout car. And consequently, there was no protection whatsoever from enemy fire or from even overhead shell fire. all we had was a canvas thing, which is rather like something you see in a child's pram, and that kept the rain off. Prior to joining the 4th Hussars, I was 3 days in a unit that was accepting for the first time these secret vehicles that were going to cross the Camacho split. And they were tanks, if you like, but open at the top, and they were completely waterproof, so they could move across water. But I wasn't to know about this. I just knew that I was there for 3 days, and I was put in charge of a unit actually taking this stuff and servicing the vehicles. And then I joined the 4th Hussars, and they were actually in the line, so that the day after, or the morning after I joined the 4th Hussars, we were already moving against the enemy. But the enemy were running away, and this was a most interesting part, because after we dealt with the Camacho, and after we dealt with the Agenta Gap, for the first time, instead of follow my leader with the tanks, we were in one open line. And it was the most amazing sight I've ever seen in my young life. All the pennants were flying, the different flags were flying, and people were firing guns into the air, and it was exactly like the cowboy films I'd seen as a young child, and that was quite something. And the Germans were definitely on the run, and we were trying to stop them getting up into Austria and from Austria into Germany. The war in Italy came to a slowdown, as it were, and we were finally told that the war in Italy had actually finished. And I remember that because we fired off all our ammunition and had a firework party. And I remember this very well because we were told that after the war had finished, we would then be responsible for every round of ammunition that was on the tanks. So everybody without exception, not wanting to be harassed with having to hand this ammunition over and get it counted and things like that, we were literally firing it into the air. So it became like a firework display. And it went on until the early hours of the morning, and we fired, not only did we fire our ammunition, we fired off our grenades, our phosphorus grenades and everything, and I'm quite certain there must have been casualties that night. The irony of losing my brother Jack is that I was not to know until literally the war had actually finished. I received a letter from home to say that Jack was missing. For a while we had false hopes. There were false stories about how he'd been saved or captured or something, but this was not the case. I was to learn more about my brother Jack's death after the war, when I received a phone call from one of his crew in which he told me that not only had my brother died, but he'd been killed with the Germans and in a camp, been marched away with the Germans and then presumably shot. It was not until I got out of the army that I was able to find the time to do the research, and I found that this was not the case, and we rather think that the wireless operator Ted Hull he was traumatized, if you like. He was badly burnt because all the crew bowed out. You need to know my brother was a mid-upper gunner on a Lancaster, and the way they were shot down was with the German night fighters flying underneath the Lancaster and shooting upwards on fixed mounts, and my brother had obviously been shot while he was still in his cabin, as it were. And then when the plane was hit and was on fire, the pilot decided to bail out, and he asked for a check of everybody. Nothing was heard from my brother, but they presumed that he knew or had already jumped, and the plane crashed, and all the members of the crew, that's the pilot, the engineer, the rear gunner, had been saved, and they were captured, and eventually they were returned to England, and my brother was the sole person who'd been killed, and we were only to learn about this after the war had finished. To return to this prisoner of war camp of the German SS cavalry division that decided to finish fighting fairly late. We went up there. Originally, we only had, I think, 2,000 prisoners, and eventually it was to build up to a large sum of prisoners. And I spoke a little bit of German, partly because of the Yiddish that was spoken in my household when I was a child, and I polished up my German. And I was on guard one night, and I was walking on the outside of the wire, and the German would be walking on the inside of the wall as a separate guard to guard against pilfering. And we would talk, because at 2 o'clock in the morning it gets a bit boring being on guard. And I asked him, as a matter of interest, what would have happened to me had I been taken prisoner a few weeks before the fighting had finished. And he considered it, and he said, well, it depends on what the position was when you were captured. He said, if you were part of a crew and all the others had been killed and you were the sole survivor, and if my officer, this is the German speaking, if my officer had noticed that on your identities this was J for Jew, he might very well have said to me, shoot him. He said, and I shoot you because if I don't shoot you, that's the officer, would shoot me. And we both accepted this. I think about this, and I was quite shocked by it. There was also another minor incident there, considering the layout of the camp. One of the perimeters of the camp was a river, and I remember being on guard duty there, and because it was in the day, I only had my pistol. As a tank crew, we always had a pistol. It's slung from our webbing, and they were laughing at me. There were half a dozen Germans there, and they were laughing at me. And I said, "Warum lachen Sie? Why are you laughing?" And the German said, "Weil Sie haben nur eine Pistole. You've only got a pistol." So I said, if you, and that's you, just you alone, decide to swim across the river, I said, this pistol is enough to do the job. I said, I'll shoot you. I said, if all of you decide to go across the river, I said, I know that all the tanks we've got in the village wouldn't stop you, and there wouldn't be much point. But they were quite happy to be prisoners.
Could you explain what the kangaroo
Yes.
actually did?
Interesting part is what the kangaroos were actually designed for and what they were to do. Prior to that, when the infantry had to go forward to the line to meet the enemy, they would march to their position. But some clever person decided that it would be a good idea to ferry them in tanks that had had the turrets taken off and could hold 1 or 2 troop of troops, and ferry them actually to the line, and then the infantry would bail out, and then they would be in a position to fire. And this was my first meeting, if you like, the London Irish, and it was those people that we carried. I remember the kangaroos because they were big vehicles. Imagine that they were, I think they were priests in this particular case, the priest vehicles, and as a wireless operator, I was wireless operator Busty Thomas, who was the SSM, and one of our duties on the battlefield was to do any job that was not officially designated to anybody else, so that we would carry prisoners back as they were taken, and we would carry wounded back, and we would find vehicles that had gone off the air for some reason or other. And we were told that one of the vehicles had gone off the air and nothing was heard of it. So we drove around a while, we swanned around on the battlefield, and we found this vehicle parked, as it were, empty in a field. And we approached it, and I always remember my feelings was it was like riding alongside a big cruiser in a tiny little motorboat, because it was the difference in our size. We as a Stuart tank were small, the Kangaroo was a big tank, and Busty said to me, nip up and have a look what's happened. So I climbed up the tank, the rails that they were provided for the infantry, and I looked inside, and it obviously had a direct overhead hit, and there was nobody inside, no bodies inside, I'm pleased to report. But the wireless set itself was smeared with all pieces of flesh. And I thought, what a way to go. And I checked up later, after the war, in the records, and I found the actual incident where the tank had actually been hit. And the troops we were carrying were certainly the London Irish. In January 46, no, sorry, in January 47, I was sent back to England because my group number was 48. You need to know that every soldier was given a group number, and this group number depended largely on their age, how long they'd been in the forces, whether they were single, whether they were married, and so you knew when you would be able to go home. I'd been at Trieste for about a year, and I haven't discussed Trieste before, but Trieste, we were there in Trieste to keep the peace between the Italians and the Yugoslavs, because the Yugoslavs, had they been given the opportunity, would have moved into Trieste, and we were there to keep the peace. But while from Trieste, I relinquished my role as tech corporal, which I trained to do, and I was sent back to England prior to being demobbed. I arrived in England in January 1947, just right for the worst winter, I think, for about 40, 50 years. The barracks were frozen. We were digging trains out of snowdrifts, and even officers were obliged to dig. Anybody below the rank of captain was obliged to help to dig out these trains. All the toilets were frozen in the barracks. And from there I was sent to York for the actual demob. And that's worth a little bit of discussion, I think, because what would happen, you would go in one end a soldier and come out the other end a civilian. You would go in wearing your army uniform, and then you would move down the way that they set it up, so that you got, first of all, you got your suit, and then you got a shirt, and then you got a tie, and I can't remember getting a hat, and that you change into it, and you leave all your clothes in a bag, and at the other end you'd come out a civilian. When I returned to the family home, having been demobbed, I was of course faced with my grieving parents, and I'd got used to it. Was one accepted when there was a loss, and I rather selfishly hadn't realised the immense gap it would make in the family. And I, as I say, I returned home, and I then did 18 months. I was to do 18 months of research about how my brother was actually killed, because we'd received conflicting reports from the flight engineer that my brother had been killed by the SS rather than killed when the plane was shot down. I was to get the final demob. Funny enough, 6 months after I left the army, I received a payment of 6 shillings and 4p from the War Office, and this had me thinking, what on earth is this about? And then I suddenly realised that when I'd first returned to England, I was given the job of picking a prisoner from Lincoln Jail, and the army had only given us haversack rations for 1 day, so this was 6 and 4p for 2 days' ration allowance that we hadn't been given, and the army, being meticulous, had decided to pay it to me. I went to a local dance hall with a couple of my army friends, and one of the army friends said to me, "There's a nice girl opposite, Ron, why don't you ask her whether you'd like to dance with her?" So I did, and she replied, "I'd love to." And the short story is, we were married then. Nita and I became engaged, and we were married for 66 years, until she was to pass away on the 16th of March 2016. In 1946, we were sent from the regiment for the first post-war regimental reunion, and Churchill was to be there. Churchill was the colonel of the regiment, and because he'd been in the regiment, and as his son had also been in the regiment. And we came down to England, and I was able to get a day at home. I remember the dinner was at the Connaught Rooms, and there was a rather amusing event there because after dinner they cleared all the waiting staff out of the room, and Churchill spoke to us, and he told some of the rudest jokes I've ever heard in my life. And apparently he was able to do this because he was colonel of the regiment, and everybody hung on every one of his words. One thing I'd like to make note of is when I had my first leave from home, I got off at the bus stop, which was about, I suppose, 50 to 100 yards away from where our house was. And outside on the front door, there were one of these posters, Welcome Home. Now, I'd been seeing all these Welcome Home posters all the way home from Dover. We'd seen them as we passed through, as the train passed the back gardens, you could see Welcome Home Jim, Welcome Home Jack. And I thought, this is nice of the family, I thought this is rather nice. And I got to the front door and it said, Welcome Home Jack. Jack was my brother-in-law who'd beaten me to the post because he'd been in Egypt longer than I had, and he's got home earlier than I had. But one of the reasons why I wanted to mention, while I was home on this particular leave, I thought that I'd gather together all the photographs I'd sent from Italy and from Africa, and because I didn't consider they were safe in the home, I took them back, and because I had time to kill in Trieste, I made an army album, and in the album I put all the photographs, pieces from my diary, postcards, song sheets, anything that I thought might be of interest to future people. And I put it into a large album which I brought home with me. And then post-war, I had the problem of what should I do with the album, which I can't give it to any one particular grandchild. I had five grandchildren. So I thought the best plan is to donate it to the Imperial War Museum. So I phoned them, spoke on the phone, discussed briefly what was in it. They were delighted to have it. And I came down and I subsequently wrote to the World War II Forum, and with photographs of me passing over the album to the... And so there in the Imperial War Museum, if anybody's interested, in the years to come, there's an album and about 200 sheets of my memoirs. When I came out of the forces, which was early in 47, I went back to the clothing trade because I knew I could immediately earn money, and I worked for a while in my father's factory. I decided that I wanted to be a pattern cutter, so I had myself taught pattern cutting. And then I somehow drifted into management because the first unit I worked at, the first company I worked for, had a factory manager who left them, and because I knew the business, I stepped into the role. And then I was to find that I was permanently into management. I worked for 3 companies, and then finally, for a period of 12 years, I had my own company in Clapham, and it was fairly successful. And my wife Nita, who had married in July 3rd, 1949, came to work for me as a secretary. And in the course of time, my 2 children married in turn, and I had 5 grandchildren. I retired when I was 63, partly because I was no longer having any fun and no longer making any money, and I thought that's a good reason to retire for. And so I've had a fairly long retirement. Nita unfortunately passed away on the 16th of March 2016, and life of course was to become completely different. I'm extremely fortunate in having 2 supportive daughters, Marsha and Ruth, and I keep house for myself with some help. I'm now 94, which is a fair age, and along the way I've seemed to have picked up some cancer and a dodgy heart. But as I might very well have had the dodgy heart before I had the cancer, and in fact it might have been something I picked up when I was young, I'm not particularly worried about it, and I seem to be self-sufficient.